Hello dear listeners, welcome to another Life History channel. I hope you are ready to sleep. By the way, before diving in, I wanted to mention that I recently had a medical procedure, so I've been working extra hard to bring you these videos. Being part of this journey by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments would mean the world to me. Have you ever wished you had blue eyes, or perhaps a different eye colour altogether? Tonight, would you like to visit the scene of one of history's most intriguing accidents? Then look deep into the eyes of someone with blue irises. Really look closely into those depths, because that mesmerizing colour you see is in fact the result of an accident. Imagine for a moment that you are the very first blue-eyed human living about 10,000 years ago. While everyone else has dark eyes, yours are the colour of the sky. Perhaps you would have been revered as a high-status figure, or perhaps you would have been completely cast out. Right now, I am taking you back to the time of that specific accident that altered the course of human history. However, this accident wasn't a physical crash involving broken bones or spilled blood. It was a silent collision occurring at a microscopic level in the darkest corner of a DNA helix. Something snapped, something in the system broke, and in that instant it triggered something that should never have existed in human history. The 600 to 800 million blue-eyed people walking the earth today. They are all living proof of that single damaged moment, the legacy of that first casualty. Whether it is a tourist on the Tokyo subway, a fisherman in the Norwegian fjords, or a child on the beaches of Brazil, even though continents separate them, they are all biologically and inextricably linked. Their roots trace back to the dusty Mesolithic era, a time when humanity was abandoning hunting to unlock the mysteries of agriculture, when the first walls were being built, and to a single, long-forgotten individual who lived in that age. Within that complex tapestry of history, a tiny typo in one person's genetic code spread like a virus, eventually signing its unique signature on the face of nearly 1 in every 10 people alive today. The most mind-boggling part of it all is this. Blue eyes are actually an optical illusion, because there isn't a single speck of blue pigment inside them. They are essentially brown eyes where production was left unfinished, cases where the pigment factory went on strike and melanin failed to reach the iris. Just like a printer that ran out of ink and ejected a blank page. And yet, this genetic deficiency, this biological void, somehow became one of the most discussed, most poeticized aesthetic features in human history. But how did nature, which normally does not forgive mistakes, turn a blind eye to this? According to the cold rules of evolutionary logic, blue eyes are a complete fiasco. They don't grant you eagle-like vision, they don't improve your night sight, and in fact quite the opposite. They are like defenseless targets with their shields down, vulnerable to the sun's harmful rays. If logic were at the wheel, natural selection should have purged these defective genes within a few generations, burying them in the dusty pages of history. But far from being wiped out, they spread uncontrollably, much like a wildfire. In just a few thousand years, that unknown ancestor's genetic legacy crossed borders, spanned oceans, and settled into the gaze of millions of people. How did an error that nature should have eliminated transform into an indispensable part of humanity? Scientists have puzzled over this question for decades. Why did blue eyes survive? More importantly, How did they thrive and spread so widely? What was the magic in this genetic accident that allowed it to not only persist but become a defining feature of entire populations? The answer isn't what you think. This isn't a story about better vision or environmental adaptation, at least not entirely. This is a story about ancient humans, sexual selection, waves of migration that reshaped continents, and DNA evidence pulled from bones that have lain underground for millennia. It is a saga about how a single mutation changed not just eye colour, but the entire structure of the human face. Because that is the truth about the blue eye mutation that no one tells you. This mutation didn't just affect colour, it altered facial features in ways scientists are only just beginning to grasp. Today, we have the technology to trace this mutation back through time. We can extract DNA from prehistoric skeletons, sequence their genes, and literally see what colour their eyes were when they were alive and breathing 8,000 years ago. We know where the mutation started. We know how it spread. We even know some of the people who carried it, identifying them through genes preserved in frozen soil and ancient graves, even though their names are lost to history. And the picture the evidence paints for us is absolutely wild. So, here is what we are going to do. We are going to track the journey of the blue eye mutation step by step, from its origin in a single person to its explosive spread through prehistoric Europe. We will put the science under a microscope to understand why eyes are coloured and what happens when that system breaks. We will explore the Mesolithic world. We will try to imagine what life was like for that first blue-eyed human living in a sea of brown eyes. And we will answer the biggest question of all. How did a random genetic error become one of humanity's most celebrated features? Because this isn't just a matter of eye colour. This is about how we became us. Before we can grasp why blue eyes are so special, we must understand why they shouldn't exist at all. Here is the thing. Evolution did not design human eyes to be colourful. It designed them to be one colour, brown. Everything else is essentially a glitch. But to understand why, we need to talk about melanin, that molecule that controls almost everything about your appearance. This is the master pigment, the biological paint that determines your skin colour, your hair colour, and yes, your eye colour. Melanin isn't just decorative. It is one of evolution's most vital inventions. It protects your DNA from ultraviolet radiation, regulates how much vitamin D your skin produces, and defends delicate tissues like a shield against sun damage. Your eyes are packed with melanin, especially in the iris, that coloured ring surrounding your pupil. The iris is fundamentally a sophisticated biological aperture, like in a camera. It opens and closes to control how much light enters your eye. But unlike a camera aperture made of metal or plastic, your iris is living tissue, and living tissue exposed to light needs protection. This is exactly where melanin comes in. The back layer of your iris is always densely pigmented. In everyone it is dark brown or black. This prevents light from scattering inside your eye and ruining your vision. But the front layer, the stroma, that is the source of visible colour. And here is the surprising part. In most people, the stroma is also full of melanin. Tons of brown melanin. This creates brown eyes, the colour possessed by roughly 80% of humanity. Brown eyes are the evolutionary default, the factory setting, the colour humans are actually supposed to have. Why? Because our species evolved in Africa, under intense sunlight. Our ancestors needed maximum protection from UV radiation in both their skin and their eyes. High melanin production wasn't just beneficial, it was essential for survival. Anyone who couldn't produce enough melanin faced a higher risk of skin cancer, eye damage, and other serious health issues. Natural selection favoured individuals who could pump out melanin efficiently and spread it throughout their bodies. The result was humans with dark skin, dark hair, and dark brown eyes. For millions of years, this was the only colour palette available. Every human walking the earth, from the earliest hominins to the modern humans who survived the bottleneck we mentioned earlier, without exception, everyone, had brown eyes. But then something changed, and this change involved a gene called OCA2. This gene is like a foreman in the melanin factory. It doesn't produce melanin directly, but it manages the production process. It regulates how much is made, where it's distributed, and what type is created. The OCA2 gene sits on chromosome 15. When it works normally, it ensures your iris produces plenty of melanin, giving you brown eyes. When its capacity drops, you get less melanin, perhaps green or hazel eyes. When it's severely broken, you get albinism, a total absence of pigment creating pink or pale blue eyes and white hair. But this is where the story gets interesting. Blue eyes are not caused by OCA2 being severely broken. They are caused by a very specific, very subtle change. A single-letter mutation in the DNA sequence right next to the OCA2 gene. Not in the gene itself, but in the regulatory region that controls how on the gene is. This mutation acts like a rheostat, a dimmer switch. It doesn't turn off melanin production entirely, it just turns it down, very, very low, in the iris, specifically in the iris. Your skin can still produce normal amounts of melanin, your hair can be dark, but your eyes produce so little melanin in the front layer of the iris that a remarkable phenomenon occurs. There is no blue pigment. Let me emphasize that again because it is counterintuitive. Blue eyes contain no blue pigment. There is no blue molecule in there making them blue. Instead, blue eyes are an optical illusion, a trick of the eye, just like the blue sky. The system works like this. When light hits an eye with very little melanin in the front layer of the iris, it penetrates the stroma. The stroma is made of collagen fibers arranged in a semi-random pattern. As light passes through this structure, an event called scattering occurs. Short wavelength light, that is blue light, scatters more than long wavelength light. The blue light bounces around inside and reflects back toward the person looking at you. The longer wavelengths pass through and are absorbed by the dark pigmented layer at the back of the iris. The result? Your eyes look blue. It is the exact same physics that makes the sky blue. There is no blue pigment in the atmosphere either. It's all about how light scatters off particles of a certain size. Your blue eyes are literally using the same optical trick as the Earth's atmosphere. By the way, if you're watching this right now, leave a comment. Write down where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm curious to see how far around the world this story about eyes has reached. Now, this explanation clarifies the physical mechanics of blue eyes, but it brings a glaring question with it. If brown eyes are the evolutionary default, and blue eyes result from a mutation that reduces melanin production, why don't blue-eyed people suffer serious health problems? Shouldn't they get more eye damage from UV radiation? Shouldn't they have more vision problems? Shouldn't natural selection have eliminated this mutation as soon as it appeared? Actually, that is exactly what should have happened, and in Africa it probably happened many times. Random mutations occur constantly. Some individuals somewhere likely developed the blue eye mutation dozens, perhaps hundreds of times over the last million years. However, under the intense African sun, blue eyes would offer no advantage and would bring various disadvantages. Those individuals likely suffered slightly higher rates of eye damage, and their mutation was wiped out along with them. But remember what we discussed in the last episode. Humans didn't stay in Africa. Some groups migrated north to Europe and Asia. They encountered vastly different environments, less intense sunlight, longer winters, and entirely different selection pressures. And somewhere in that changing world, between roughly 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, someone was born with this mutation. One person, one ancestor. And for reasons we are about to explore, this mutation didn't disappear. On the contrary, it spread like a wildfire. In just a few thousand years, a significant percentage of the European population had blue eyes. A transformation from a single individual to millions, from a random genetic error to one of the most recognizable human features. There is a point here that confuses many people. You've likely noticed that many babies are born with blue eyes, even if their parents have brown eyes. These eyes usually change colour within the first 1 or 2 years of life, eventually turning brown or green. So what is happening there? Essentially, it is the same phenomenon we've been discussing, just playing out over a developmental process. Newborn babies haven't finished their melanin production yet. Their melanin-producing cells, called melanocytes, are still ramping up production at birth. Even babies who will eventually have brown eyes often have very little melanin in their iris stroma at birth. This creates a temporary blue eye appearance due to the same scattering effect. As the baby grows and the melanocytes mature, melanin production increases. The stroma slowly fills with pigment. Over months or years, the blue fades, and the genetically determined true eye colour emerges. If the baby has the blue eye mutation, melanin production remains permanently suppressed, and the eyes stay blue for life. If they don't have the mutation, melanin continues to accumulate, and the eyes turn brown or green depending on exactly how much melanin is produced and what type. This whispers an important truth to us. Eye colour isn't a simple on/off switch. It is a spectrum controlled by multiple genes. While OCA2 and its neighbour HERC2 do most of the work, the specific combination of genetic variants you inherit from your parents determines where you fall on the spectrum. Lots of melanin creates brown eyes. Moderate amounts create green or hazel eyes. Very little creates blue eyes. And this specific mutation we are talking about, the one causing blue eyes, is so effective at suppressing melanin production that it overrides almost every other factor. This is what geneticists call high penetrance. If you possess 2 copies of the blue eye mutation, one from each parent, you will have blue eyes. No exceptions. No other genetic factor can stand in its way. So now we understand the foundation. Brown eyes are normal. Blue eyes are a mutation that suppresses melanin production through a very specific regulatory change. The physics of scattering creates the colour blue from colourless tissue. But we still haven't answered the biggest question. Why did this mutation spread? How did one person's random genetic accident become the eye color of hundreds of millions? This is where the story gets truly gripping. Because the spread of blue eyes isn't just about genetics. It's about sex, survival, and strange preferences that pushed human evolution in directions no one expected. We know blue eyes shouldn't exist. We know they are the result of a broken gene, a glitch in the melanin production system that normally gives everyone brown eyes. But here is where the story gets absolutely crazy. In 2008, a research team at the University of Copenhagen published a study that changed everything we thought we knew about human genetic diversity. What they discovered wasn't just interesting, it was statistically impossible, or at least it should have been. The team, led by Professor Hans Eiberg, had been studying the genetics of eye color for over a decade. They had collected DNA samples from blue-eyed individuals across multiple continents: Denmark, Jordan, India, Turkey. They wanted to understand the genetic basis of blue eyes, decode which genes were involved, and how the trait was inherited. Standard population genetics work. However, when they analyzed the data, they found something that caused them to check their equipment, rerun their tests, and question whether they had made a catastrophic error in their methods. Every single blue-eyed person from every population they tested, from every geographic region, from every ethnic background, carried exactly the same mutation, not a similar mutation, not different mutations in the same gene, the exact identical genetic change in the exact same position in their DNA. Let me explain why this is so bizarre. Human genetic diversity is messy. When a trait evolves independently in different populations, it usually involves different mutations, different genetic pathways. If 10 different human groups had independently developed lighter skin, they likely would have done so via 10 different sets of genetic changes. That is how evolution normally works, multiple solutions to the same problem. But blue eyes weren't like that. The mutation was singular, precise, and identical across all populations. This was like finding 10 people who invented the wheel independently, only to discover that all 10 wheels were exactly 42.7 centimeters in diameter, made of the same species of oak, with exactly 17 spokes arranged in the same pattern. The odds of this happening by chance are astronomically low. We are talking about massive numbers, difficult to comprehend, more than all the atoms in the observable universe. This left only one possible explanation. Blue eyes did not evolve multiple times in different populations. They evolved once, in one person, and every blue-eyed person living today is a direct descendant of that single individual. The mutation itself is located in a gene called HERX2. HERX2 doesn't control eye color directly. That job belongs to a different gene we mentioned earlier, OCA2. OCA2 is the master regulator of melanin production in the iris. It is the gene that gives you brown eyes when functioning normally. However, HERX2 sits right next to OCA2 on chromosome 15 and acts as a genetic switch. Think of OCA2 as a light bulb and HERX2 as a dimmer switch connected to it. The mutation in HERX2 doesn't break the bulb, it simply turns the dimmer down, reducing the amount of melanin the OCA2 gene produces. This specific mutation is tiny, a single letter change in the 3 billion letter instruction manual called human DNA. One nucleotide, a chemical building block, switching from one variant to another. In genetic language, this is a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. Its scientific designation is RS129138832. Just a tiny change, but enough to turn brown eyes blue. What is remarkable is how precisely this mutation works. It doesn't stop melanin production completely. If it did, you would get albinism, which causes much more serious problems than just blue eyes. Instead, it reduces melanin production by exactly the right amount, enough to eliminate the brown pigment in the iris, but not enough to affect melanin production in the skin, hair, or other tissues where it is needed for protection. Almost surgical precision, as if someone went into the human genome with a scalpel and made the smallest change to alter eye color without breaking anything else. So when did this happen? When did this one person, this single human with a brand new mutation, open their eyes for the first time and present a color to the world that had never existed before? The Copenhagen team used multiple dating methods to estimate the age of the mutation. They looked at the genetic diversity surrounding the mutation site.
They analyzed the geographic distribution of blue-eyed populations. They built computational models of how the mutation would spread through ancient populations. All the evidence points to the same time window, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Let's split the difference and say about 8,000 years ago, roughly 6,000 BC. Now think about what the world was like back then. The Ice Age had ended. Agriculture was just beginning to transform human societies in the Fertile Crescent. People were starting to settle in permanent villages, domesticate animals, plant crops. In Europe, the Mesolithic era reigned, a transitional phase between the old world of hunter-gatherers and the new world of farmers. The most likely location for this mutation is somewhere around the Black Sea region, probably modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia or northern Turkey. Genetic evidence suggests the mutation originated somewhere in this general area and then spread outward with migrating populations. Picture it, 6,000 BC. In a small settlement near the Black Sea, a woman gives birth. The birth is normal, the baby is healthy, but when the baby opens its eyes for the first time, everyone sees something impossible. Instead of the universal brown of human eyes, these eyes are blue, not the pale blue of someone with albinism, which would have been perceived as a disorder, but a clear, bright blue, strange and striking. Did the parents think their child was cursed, blessed, or touched by spirits? We will never know, but we know that child survived to adulthood. We know they had children of their own. We know that despite starting as a single copy of a random mutation in one person, the blue eye variant spread to become one of the most common genetic traits in entire regions of the world. This is where the story gets even stranger, because the mathematical probability of this happening, of a single neutral mutation reaching frequencies of 70–80% in some populations, is nearly as impossible as the mutation itself. Neutral mutations changes that don't provide a survival advantage usually drift randomly within populations. Most disappear within a few generations. The vast majority never make it past a tiny percentage of the population. For a neutral trait to reach such high frequencies so quickly across multiple populations requires either incredible luck spread over thousands of generations, or something else, something that made blue eyes not neutral at all. There are only a few mechanisms capable of driving a rare trait to high frequency so quickly. Population bottlenecks, where most of the population dies off and the survivors happen to carry unusual genes, can do it. However, there is no evidence of a massive bottleneck in European populations during this period. Genetic drift in small isolated populations can cause random traits to become common, but the blue eye mutation spread too widely across too many different populations to be explained by drift alone, which leaves one primary mechanism: sexual selection. The mutation spread because blue-eyed people were more attractive, more desired as mates. They had more children. Their children inherited the trait, and they too were more desired. Generation after generation, the trait became more common, not because it helped people survive, but because it helped them reproduce. But why? Why would a simple change in eye color be so attractive? What made blue eyes so desirable in human societies 8,000 years ago that they spread across continents? Here is where the story takes another turn. Because it's not just about attractiveness, it might be about survival after all, just not in the way anyone expected. The same genetic changes transforming human societies, the transition from dark-skinned hunter-gatherers to lighter-skinned agricultural populations, were creating new evolutionary pressures that would make a mutation affecting pigmentation far more important than anyone could imagine, and blue eyes were just the beginning of the changes this mutation would bring to the human face. Imagine Europe 8,000 years ago. Not the Europe you know. Forget the cities, highways and farmlands stretching to the horizon. This was a world unrecognizable to modern eyes. It was a wilderness so vast and untamed that a person could walk for weeks without seeing another human being. Dense forests covered everything from Spain to Scandinavia. Ancient oaks and beech trees, so massive 5 people couldn't link arms around their trunks. Vegetation so thick you had to hack your way through with stone tools. And animals everywhere, herds of aurochs, massive wild cattle standing 1.8 meters at the shoulder, red deer gliding through forest clearings in groups of 50 or more, wild boars crashing through the undergrowth, brown bears fishing in the rivers, wolves howling in the darkness beyond the firelight. This was the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, the interim between the end of the Ice Age and the arrival of agriculture. And somewhere in this wild world, someone was born with eyes the color of a summer sky.
Eyes that shouldn't exist. Eyes carrying a mutation no human had ever possessed before. We know this person existed, not their name, not their story, but we know they lived because every blue-eyed human living today carries their genetic signature. But for a long time, we didn't know what they looked like. We didn't know their world. We couldn't put a face to the ancestor who changed human appearance forever. Then in 2006, 2 hikers exploring a cave system in the Cantabrian mountains of northwestern Spain stumbled upon something extraordinary: human remains. Not just any remains, but a nearly complete skeleton preserved for 8,000 years by the cool, dry cave environment. The bones belonged to a man who lived at the dawn of the Mesolithic, dying in his early 30s. They named him Lineage 1, after the cave where he was found. The skeleton sat in a lab for years. It was interesting, certainly well preserved, but just one of thousands of prehistoric humans archaeologists had already catalogued. Then came the DNA revolution. In 2014, researchers finally managed to extract and sequence ancient DNA from Lineage's tooth enamel. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about prehistoric Europeans. Lineage had blue eyes. Striking bright blue eyes. The genetic markers were unmistakable. He carried the exact same mutation in the OCA2 gene that creates blue eyes in Europeans today. But here is where it gets wild. His skin was dark, not slightly tan, not Mediterranean olive, dark brown, like modern humans in sub-Saharan Africa. The genetic analysis was clear. Lineage had the darkest skin pigmentation possible for a European hunter-gatherer. Think about what that means. A man walking through the prehistoric forests of Spain with dark brown skin and piercing blue eyes. This was not what anyone expected. The assumption had always been that Europeans developed lighter skin first as an adaptation to lower UV radiation in northern latitudes, and acquired eye color variation later. But the DNA told a different story. The blue eye mutation appeared and spread while European populations were still dark-skinned. These two traits evolved on completely different timelines independently. The discovery of Lineage opened the floodgates. Suddenly, researchers realized they could reconstruct not just the bones, but the appearance of prehistoric humans. They began testing every well-preserved skeleton they could find, and a pattern emerged. Europe in the Mesolithic was full of dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers. Not everyone had blue eyes, of course. The mutation was still spreading, but it was common enough to pop up repeatedly in the archaeological record. So who were these people? What was their world actually like? Contrary to what old textbooks claimed, they weren't nomadic wanderers, but lived in small groups of perhaps 20 to 50 people, bound by kinship and marriage ties. Recent archaeological evidence shows they returned to the same places seasonally, following predictable cycles of resource availability. Summer camps near rivers where salmon ran. Autumn harvest sites where hazelnuts and acorns could be gathered and stored. Winter shelters in caves and rock overhangs where they could wait out the harshest months. Their technology was sophisticated in ways we are only just beginning to appreciate. They used stone tools, yes, but crafted with incredible precision. Microliths, tiny sharp blades that could be combined to create composite tools, hafted axes with carefully honed edges, bone needles fine enough to sew waterproof clothing. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of complex food processing techniques. They roasted nuts in pit ovens to facilitate storage, smoked fish and meat to last through the winter, possibly fermented plant material to produce primitive alcohol. Though evidence for that is still debated, they had deciphered which plants were edible, which were medicinal, and which were deadly. A body of knowledge that must have accumulated over generations and required complex language to transmit. Their social worlds were likely rich and complex. Burial sites from this era show evidence of ritual and ceremony. Bodies placed with care, sometimes with grave goods, ochre pigments, perforated seashells that might have been jewelry. These were people who contemplated death, mourned their loved ones, and had beliefs about what came after. And into this world, someone with blue eyes was born. Try to imagine what that was like in a community where literally everyone you saw had brown eyes. A child is born with eyes the color of ice, deep water, the midday sky. This wasn't a subtle variation. This was dramatic, obvious, likely a bit unsettling to people who had never seen anything like it before. The child would have been noticed immediately, not just by their family, but by everyone in the community. In a world where physical appearance was one of the few ways to distinguish individuals, where personal identity was crucially important in small, tight-knit groups, this would be extraordinarily notable. They would stick in memories, take center stage in stories, stand out when visitors from other groups came to trade or arrange marriages. And the thing about standing out in prehistoric societies is this: the result could go either way. Sometimes being different meant being special, chosen, marked by the spirits for a great purpose. The archaeological record suggests people with unusual physical traits were sometimes treated with special regard, elaborate burials, positions of authority, evidence of being valued by their community. But sometimes being different meant being dangerous, potentially cursed. Someone to be driven out or killed before they brought misfortune to the group. The survival and spread of the blue eye mutation tell us something very important. These individuals were not killed, they were not outcasts, they were accepted. And more than that, they were likely desired, because the mutation didn't just survive, it exploded across the European population at a rate that genetics tells us can only happen through one mechanism: sexual selection. Blue-eyed people had more children, significantly more children. The math is actually terrifying. For a neutral mutation providing no survival advantage to reach the frequency blue eyes did in just a few thousand years, carriers would need to have 15 to 20% more offspring than non-carriers. That is a massive margin. That is the kind of selection pressure usually reserved for traits that directly affect survival, like disease resistance or better food processing ability. But blue eyes don't help you hunt. They don't make you better at gathering plants, building shelter, or surviving winter. If anything, light eyes are slightly disadvantaged in bright sunlight, offering less protection against UV damage than dark eyes. So why did they spread? What made blue-eyed individuals so reproductively successful in those Mesolithic communities? The answer requires us to think about attraction, beauty standards, how humans choose mates, and why. It requires understanding something that might seem trivial, but turns out to be one of the most powerful forces in human evolution: sexual selection. The same force that gave peacocks their exaggerated tails and lions their magnificent manes. And it was about to change the face of an entire continent. So the puzzle is this. Around 10,000 years ago, somewhere near the Black Sea, a single person was born with blue eyes. One individual carrying one mutation. Fast forward just 8,000 years to the present day, and that mutation has spread to nearly 40% of Europeans, with pockets of blue-eyed populations scattered from Scandinavia to Syria. This isn't slow evolutionary drift. This is an explosion. Something caused blue eyes to spread faster than almost any other physical trait in human history. The question is, why? Natural selection is what people mostly think of when they hear evolution. Traits that help you survive get passed on. Traits that kill you get lost. Simple, brutal, effective. But Darwin identified another force, just as powerful and far more interesting: sexual selection. This isn't about survival, it's about reproduction. Specifically, it's about who gets chosen as a mate and who doesn't. Here is the vital difference. Natural selection cares about whether you reach reproductive age. Sexual selection cares about whether anyone wants to breed with you once you get there. You can be the fittest, strongest individual in your population with the highest survival capability, but if no one chooses you as a mate, your genes are an evolutionary dead end. Your perfect survival adaptations are buried with you. This is why peacocks have those exaggerated tails, those huge, colourful, completely impractical tails that make them easy targets for predators. Natural selection would eliminate those tails in a heartbeat because they are a liability for survival. but female peacocks prefer males with bigger, brighter tails, so sexual selection promotes the very trait natural selection should eliminate. Peacocks with the showiest tails find more mates, produce more offspring, and pass on the genes for even showier tails. Blue eyes might be the human version of the peacock's tail, not a survival advantage but a mating advantage. And in small populations, mating advantages can spread frighteningly fast. The mechanism is called the novelty advantage hypothesis. When everyone around you looks basically the same, anyone who looks different stands out. And standing out in the right context ensures you get noticed, remembered, chosen. Imagine a Mesolithic community in modern-day Ukraine. The population is maybe 50 to 60 people. Everyone has brown eyes, dark hair, medium skin tones. They all look like variations on the same theme because they are all closely related. They are all descendants of the same small founding population that settled this area a few hundred generations ago. Then someone is born with blue eyes, not just slightly lighter brown, but bright, startling blue that is impossible to ignore. That person doesn't fade into the background. When looking at them, you remember it. When choosing a mate, they draw attention. When they have children, people notice which kids inherited the trait. Studies in modern populations show that blue eyes trigger interesting reactions. In several experiments, participants rated blue-eyed faces as more trustworthy, attractive, or memorable compared to the same faces with brown eyes. The effect is small but measurable, and in evolutionary terms, small effects repeated over hundreds of generations become massive differences. But what makes this truly powerful is this. The rarity advantage only works when the trait is rare. If everyone has blue eyes, no one stands out. Therefore, the effect is strongest in the first generations after the mutation appears. That first blue-eyed person and their direct descendants would have experienced the maximum possible advantage. Later, as blue eyes became more common, the advantage would diminish. This creates a kind of evolutionary sweet spot. The mutation spreads rapidly at first because it is new and striking. Then, as the trait becomes less unusual, the spread slows down. Eventually, you reach an equilibrium where blue eyes are no longer particularly noteworthy, but brown eyes haven't become the rare attractive variant either. And that is pretty much what we see in European populations. Blue eyes spread explosively for a few thousand years, then stabilized at frequencies ranging from 10 to 80% depending on the region. They don't take over completely, but they don't disappear either. But there is another theory, a much more controversial one, that causes evolutionary biologists to argue in ways that shock their students. The paternity certainty hypothesis. Warning, this gets a bit weird. The basic idea is this. In any species where males invest heavily in offspring, males need a way to be reasonably certain that the offspring they are raising are actually theirs. In most mammals, this isn't a big issue because males don't stick around to raise the young. But humans are different. Human babies are helpless for years. They require massive parental investment. Throughout much of human evolution, males investing resources in children genetically not their own were at a huge evolutionary disadvantage. Blue eyes might have offered a solution. Brown eyes are dominant. Blue eyes are recessive. If both parents have blue eyes, all their children will have blue eyes, period. No exceptions. So, in a population where blue eyes appear as a trait, a blue-eyed male choosing a blue-eyed female could be absolutely certain that any blue-eyed children were his. The hypothesis suggests that blue-eyed individuals preferentially chose other blue-eyed mates, creating what geneticists call assortative mating, and if this preference was strong enough, it would create a self-reinforcing loop. Blue-eyed people have blue-eyed children who preferentially mate with other blue-eyed people, creating more blue-eyed descendants that continue the pattern. Now, let's get to why this theory makes people argue. First, it assumes a level of genetic knowledge Mesolithic people definitely didn't have. They couldn't know eye color was heritable in specific patterns. They wouldn't understand dominant and recessive alleles. Therefore, any preference for mates with the same eye color would have to be instinctive or cultural, not rational. Second, there isn't much evidence for strong assortative mating based on eye color in modern populations. Blue-eyed people don't overwhelmingly prefer blue-eyed partners. If they did, we would expect to see much more extreme frequency differences than we actually observe. Third, and most damning, the math doesn't really work. Even with strong assortative mating preferences, the spread of blue eyes happened too fast to be explained by paternity certainty alone. You would need additional evolutionary forces pushing the trait forward. So if it's not just sexual selection, and likely not paternity certainty, what else explains the explosive spread? 2 words: genetic drift. In small populations, random chance plays a huge role in which genes get passed on and which get lost. Imagine a village of 40 people, where one person carries the blue eye mutation. That person might have more children than average simply by chance. Maybe they are healthy and live to old age, while others die young. Maybe their children survive a disease outbreak that kills the children of other families. None of this has anything to do with eye color, but the blue eye gene spreads anyway because it happened to be in the lucky individuals. This is especially powerful when populations expand into new territories. The Mesolithic in Europe was a time of rapid population growth after the ice sheets retreated. Small groups were constantly breaking off and settling new areas. If the founders of these new settlements happened to include a high proportion of blue-eyed individuals just by chance, the new population would have a much higher frequency of blue eyes than the parent population. Geneticists call this the founder effect, and it can create dramatic differences between closely related populations in just a few generations. Some parts of Europe might have received founder populations with multiple blue-eyed individuals. Others might have been settled by groups with no blue-eyed members at all. This explains why blue eye frequencies vary so dramatically across Europe, over 80% in Finland and Estonia, while under 10% in southern Europe. So, what really happened? Likely it was all of them working together. Sexual selection providing a kickstart advantage when blue eyes were rare and novel. Genetic drift, amplifying those small advantages in expanding populations. Founder effects creating regional pockets where blue eyes became especially common. And perhaps, just perhaps, a bit of assortative mating reinforcing the patterns once established. Evolution is rarely driven by a single simple mechanism. It is messy, complex, involving multiple forces working in different directions simultaneously. Winning traits are those supported by enough of these forces at the right times. Blue eyes won, not because they helped anyone survive, not because they made anyone smarter or stronger, but in the context of the expanding populations, social structures, and mating preferences of Mesolithic Europe, blue eyes were interesting enough to be remembered, distinct enough to be attractive, and lucky enough to be in the right populations at the right times. Within 4,000 years, what started as a single mutation in one person had spread to half a continent, not through any major adaptive advantage, but through the accumulated power of millions of individual mate choices, thousands of lucky population expansions, and the relentless math of gene flow in expanding populations. But here is the crazy part. While sexual selection was spreading blue eyes across Europe, something else was happening. Something that might have actually provided a survival advantage to blue eyes. But sexual selection doesn't explain everything, because there is another possibility. Less romantic, but probably more important for survival. What if blue eyes weren't just attractive? What if they actually helped you live longer? Welcome to the vitamin D hypothesis, and this is a bit messy. What we know for sure is this. Vitamin D is absolutely critical for human survival. Not just helpful, vital. Without enough vitamin D, your bones don't develop properly. Children get rickets, their legs bowing under their own weight. Adults develop osteomalacia, their bones softening and becoming prone to fractures. Pregnant women without enough vitamin D have higher complication rates. Their babies are more likely to die. For most of human history, this wasn't a problem. Our ancestors evolved in Africa under intense sunlight. UV radiation hits the skin and triggers vitamin D synthesis. Plenty of sun, plenty of vitamin D. The evolutionary solution was simple: dark skin providing protection from UV damage while allowing enough vitamin D production. But then humans started moving north. Imagine the descendants of that blue-eyed individual spreading into Europe during the Mesolithic. They are moving into regions unlike anywhere humans had lived before, not just colder, but darker. Northern Europe gets maybe 8 hours of daylight in winter, sometimes less. And even when the sun appears, it stays low on the horizon, weak, indirect. The UV radiation triggering vitamin D synthesis drops to a fraction of what it is in Africa or the Mediterranean. Now here is where it gets interesting. Dark skin, which is a survival advantage in sunny climates, suddenly becomes a liability. Melanin, the pigment making skin dark, blocks UV radiation. That is its job. In Africa, this protection is crucial. Too much UV causes skin cancer, destroys folate, leads to birth defects. But in Northern Europe, UV radiation isn't the problem anymore. The problem is not getting enough of it. So natural selection starts favoring lighter skin. Not immediately, not all at once, but over thousands of years, individuals with genetic variants producing less melanin had an advantage. They could synthesize more vitamin D from the limited available sunlight. They had healthier children. Those children survived to reproduce. The genes spread. This part is not controversial. Scientists have strong evidence that light skin evolved independently in multiple human populations, moving into low sunlight environments. Europeans became lighter skinned. East Asians became lighter skinned via different genetic pathways. Same environmental pressure, different genetic solutions. But what about blue eyes? The hypothesis is maybe eye color and skin color evolved together as part of the same adaptive package. The genes controlling skin pigmentation and eye pigmentation aren't identical, but they are related. They are part of the same broader genetic system, determining how much melanin your body produces and where. So perhaps the mutation creating blue eyes didn't spread just because humans found it attractive. Maybe it spread because it was linked to lighter skin, and lighter skin kept people alive. Some researchers go further. They point out that blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair all tend to cluster in the same populations. The highest frequencies of all three traits are found in Scandinavia and the Baltic region, the same areas with the lowest UV radiation levels in the inhabited world. They argue this can't be a coincidence. This is natural selection signing its name on the human genome. The timeline seems to support this. The blue eye mutation appears about 10,000 years ago. The major expansion of farming populations into Northern Europe happens between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago. As these populations move north, facing increasingly severe vitamin D challenges, the frequency of blue eyes, light skin, and blonde hair all increase together. It is a compelling story. Population moves north. Environment exerts selection pressure. Advantageous traits spread. Classic Darwinian evolution. But this is where skeptics start raising objections. Problem 1. Blue eyes don't actually help with vitamin D synthesis. The pigmentation we are talking about is in the iris, the colored part of the eye. It doesn't affect how much UV radiation reaches the skin. Having blue eyes versus brown eyes makes zero difference in your body's ability to produce vitamin D. Iris pigmentation and skin pigmentation are controlled by related but distinct genetic pathways. Just because they are related doesn't mean one causes the other. Problem 2. The timing is weird. The mutation creating blue eyes appears about 10,000 years ago, but genetic analyses show light skin was already common in Europeans by that point. Some variants for light skin date back 30,000 years or more. So if light skin was the real survival advantage, why did blue eyes appear so late and spread so fast? If they were just hitching a ride with skin color genes, you would expect a much slower, more gradual spread. Problem 3. Geography doesn't fit exactly. Yes, blue eyes are most common in Scandinavia and the Baltic, but they are also found at significant frequencies in places getting plenty of sunlight. Germany, the UK, even parts of southern France have blue-eyed populations. Meanwhile, some populations living in extremely low-light environments like the Sami people in northern Scandinavia have relatively low blue-eye frequencies. If this was entirely about vitamin D, you would expect a much tighter correlation between latitude and eye color. Problem 4, and this is the big one. Other human populations solved the northern sunlight problem without blue eyes. East Asians also moved to high latitudes. They developed light skin via different genetic mutations, but they didn't develop blue eyes. They didn't develop blonde hair, they retained dark eyes and dark hair while adapting perfectly to low UV environments. This suggests blue eyes aren't actually necessary for survival in the north. So what is really going on? Most likely it is complex. The truth is probably somewhere between pure sexual selection and pure survival advantage. Blue eyes might have started spreading because humans found them attractive. But once they reached a certain frequency in northern European populations, they might have been maintained by a weak link to light skin genes, not strong enough to drive their initial spread, but enough to keep them from disappearing. Think of it this way. The blue eye mutation appears in a population already under selection pressure for light skin. The mutation doesn't help directly with vitamin D, but it doesn't hurt. And it makes you stand out in a world where everyone has brown eyes. So sexual selection starts pushing it up in frequency. As it spreads, it becomes more common in individuals carrying light skin genes, not because they are directly linked, but simply because they are in the same population experiencing the same selection pressures. Over time, blue eyes become associated with successful adaptation to northern environments, not because they caused that success, but because they were there when it happened. They become part of the phenotype package, the collection of traits characterizing northern European populations. But what keeps the vitamin D hypothesis so persistent despite the objections is this: Scandinavia. Because when you look at the global distribution of blue eyes, one pattern is undeniable. The highest frequencies, the places where blue eyes are most common, are exactly where vitamin D challenges are most severe. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia. These aren't just north, they are northern and cloudy. Dark forests and long winters, months where the sun barely rises above the horizon. In parts of Finland, over 80% of the population has blue eyes. In Estonia, it is over 90%. These are some of the highest frequencies of any physical trait in any human population anywhere. Something made blue eyes extraordinarily successful in these specific environments. Maybe it was sexual selection operating with unusual intensity in small isolated populations. Maybe it was genetic drift, random chance amplified by population bottlenecks. Maybe it was a weak survival advantage that only mattered in the most extreme low-light environments. Or perhaps most likely, it was all these factors working together, because evolution doesn't operate on single causes. It isn't one factor pushing a trait in one direction. It is multiple selection pressures, random genetic drift, population structure, cultural preferences, all interacting in complicated ways over thousands of generations. Blue eyes spread to northern Europe through a combination of all these forces. We are still trying to figure out exactly what that combination was. But one thing is certain. By 5,000 years ago, blue eyes were firmly established in northern European populations. The mutation that started in one person had spread to millions and was about to change human history in ways no one could have predicted, because those blue-eyed northern Europeans were about to start migrating again, and when they did, they would carry their distinctive eye color to the farthest corners of the earth, creating the patterns of genetic diversity we are still mapping today. For most of human history, we could only guess what our ancestors looked like. We had their bones, their tools, their art, but the true color of their eyes, their skin, their hair, that was lost to time, until it wasn't. In 2010, everything changed. A team of scientists at the Center for Geogenetics in Copenhagen published a paper that looked almost like science fiction. They had extracted DNA from human bones, thousands of years old, and reconstructed not just who these people were related to, but what they actually looked like. Eye color, hair color, skin tone, all encoded in genetic sequences that had somehow survived being buried in the earth for millennia. This was revolutionary, because DNA isn't supposed to last that long. It is a fragile molecule, constantly breaking down, chopping into smaller and smaller fragments until there is nothing left to analyze. In tropical climates, DNA might be completely gone in a few hundred years. Even in ideal conditions, cold and dry environments, most DNA becomes unreadable after about 10,000 years. But most is not all, and scientists had figured out how to work with what remained. The technique works like this. You take a sample from inside a tooth or the densest part of a long bone, places where DNA degradation happens slowest. You extract every scrap of genetic material you can find, most of it contaminated with bacteria DNA, fungi DNA, DNA from every organism that has been in contact with the bone for thousands of years. Then you use computational methods to filter out the contamination, identify the pieces that are truly human, and stitch them together like the world's most complicated jigsaw puzzle, where 90% of the pieces are missing, and the other 5% are from totally different puzzles. It is painstaking work. A single analysis can take months or years. But when it works, when you finally reconstruct enough of the genome to identify specific genes, you can answer questions historians have been asking for centuries. And in 2018, one of those questions got an answer that shocked everyone. The discovery came from a site called Gav's Cave in southwestern England. Inside, archaeologists had found a nearly complete skeleton of a man who died during the Mesolithic, about 10,000 years ago. He became known as Cheddar Man, named after the nearby village. For decades, museum reconstructions showed him with light skin and brown hair, because everyone assumed that is what ancient Britons looked like. Everyone was wrong. When scientists finally sequenced Cheddar Man's genome, they found something unexpected. The blue-eye genes were there, both copies, clear as day, but the light skin genes were missing. Cheddar Man had dark skin, dark curly hair, and bright blue eyes, a combination that essentially doesn't exist in modern populations. He looked nothing like the people living in England today, despite being their direct ancestor. This was revolutionary, not just because of what Cheddar Man looked like, but because of what his appearance revealed about European genetic history. Light skin didn't evolve in Europe. It was imported, arriving thousands of years after blue eyes. But Cheddar Man wasn't alone. As ancient DNA technology improved, more surprises emerged from prehistoric bones across Europe. In Luxembourg, scientists analyzed the remains of a man from the Lochbour rock shelter, another Mesolithic hunter-gatherer who died about 8,000 years ago. Same combination, blue eyes, dark skin, dark hair. In Spain, at the La Branya cave, 2 more hunter-gatherers from 7,000 years ago, blue eyes, dark skin. In Sweden, on the island of Gotland, remains from 5,000 years ago, blue eyes, dark skin. The pattern was unmistakable. For thousands of years after blue eyes first appeared, the people carrying this mutation looked radically different from modern Europeans. They were descendants of populations that evolved in Africa, still carrying high melanin production that provided protection against intense UV radiation, but they also carried that single mutation in the OCA2 gene that gave them blue eyes. Think about how strange that is. Blue eyes evolved in a population that didn't have light skin yet. The mutation spread, became common, stayed in the population for thousands of years before the genes for light skin arrived. This tells us something crucial about how evolution actually works. It isn't coordinated, it isn't designed. Traits don't evolve together just because they seem like they should fit. Blue eyes spread because they provided an advantage or people found them sexually preferable. Light skin evolved separately, in response to different selection pressures, and eventually both traits ended up in the same populations. Not because evolution planned it that way, but because human populations mixed, merged, and swapped genes over thousands of years. So where did the light skin genes come from? Ancient DNA gave us that answer too. About 8,000 years ago, a massive migration began that would fundamentally transform European genetics. Farming communities from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, began moving into Europe, bringing agriculture, pottery, domesticated animals, and a completely different genetic profile with them. These Neolithic farmers looked nothing like the hunter-gatherers they encountered. They had lighter skin, brown eyes, and dark hair. They had developed their light skin in the Middle East, where reduced sunlight during agricultural life in settled communities favored lighter pigmentation for vitamin D production. The archaeological record shows what happened next. Over about 2,000 years, agriculture spread across almost all of Europe. The genetic record shows something more complex. The farmers didn't just replace the hunter-gatherers, they mixed with them. They formed hybrid communities, exchanged genes and culture. The blue eyes of the hunter-gatherers met the light skin of the farmers, and for the first time, populations resembling modern Europeans appeared. But the story wasn't over. About 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived. From the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea came the Yamnaya, horse-riding, bronze-working pastoralists, herders. They were tall, heavily built, and carried genes for light skin, light hair, and sometimes blue eyes. They also brought lactose tolerance, the ability to digest milk in adulthood, which would become dominant in northern Europe. The Yamnaya migration was catastrophic for existing populations. Genetic analyses show that in some regions, 90% of male lineages were replaced within just a few generations. This suggests violent conquest, not peaceful integration. The Yamnaya and their descendants essentially took over, bringing with them new languages that would eventually evolve into most modern European languages, new social structures, and new genetic profiles. Modern Europeans are the product of these three groups. Roughly speaking, about 10% of your DNA comes from those original blue-eyed, dark-skinned hunter-gatherers. About 40% comes from Neolithic farmers, and about 50% comes from the Yamnaya and related steppe populations. The exact proportions vary depending on where in Europe your ancestors lived, but the three-way mix is consistent across the continent. This means if you have blue eyes today, there is a very high probability you inherited them from those original hunter-gatherers. The mutation was passed down through 10,000 years of dozens of migrations, conquests, and population replacements. Your eyes are a direct link to people who looked radically different from you but shared that one specific genetic trait, and we only know this thanks to ancient DNA, because scientists figured out how to extract genetic information from bones buried for millennia. Every year, new techniques emerge, allowing us to analyze older samples, extract more information, answer questions we couldn't ask 10 years ago. Recently, researchers managed to extract DNA from a 400,000-year-old human ancestor in Spain. 400,000 years. That is older than our species. and yet fragments of DNA survived, enough to tell us about the relationships between different human lineages, just as Neanderthals were beginning to diverge from our ancestors. The ancient DNA revolution is still accelerating. With every new genome sequenced, we learn more about where we came from, how we evolved, and why we look the way we do. We are rewriting human history not from written records or archaeological interpretations, but from the genetic blueprints carried in prehistoric bones. And those blueprints tell us stories more complex and surprising than anyone imagined. Stories like blue eyes appearing thousands of years before light skin, about traits we think belong together, actually arriving in populations from completely different sources at completely different times, about our ancestors not looking the way we guessed. However, ancient DNA revealed something else, something directly connected to why blue eyes spread so fast after they appeared. Human populations were never isolated, never stayed pure. Throughout our entire history, we mixed, migrated, carried genes over vast distances, and in this constant genetic exchange, some traits traveled faster than others. Blue eyes didn't stay put. Once that original mutation rose to prominence in ancient Europe, it didn't just sit politely north of the Mediterranean waiting for modern borders to be drawn. It moved with people. It hitched a ride on trade routes, in migrations, in kidnapped captives, in traveling shepherds and shipwrecked sailors. And today, if you look closely enough, you find its fingerprints in places they absolutely shouldn't be if you didn't know the real story. Let's zoom out first. If you could dim the lights on the planet and let only blue eyes shine, the brightest patch would still be Northern and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, parts of northern Germany, Poland, Russia. In some of these regions, more than half the population has light-colored eyes. In a few, it's closer to 3/4. If you grow up there, blue eyes aren't special. They are background noise. Move south and west, and the glow dims. In much of southern Europe, blue and green eyes are common, but brown dominates. Cross into the Mediterranean, the southern coasts, the Middle East, South Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa, and brown eyes take over almost completely. Not because blue eyes belong to Europeans in some deep fundamental way, but because of where this mutation first became common and how many times it was diluted by other genes. That is the basic map. But when you zoom in, the story gets weird, because right in the middle of overwhelmingly brown-eyed populations, you suddenly stumble upon pockets of light-colored eyes looking like they were dropped there by a careless time traveler. Take Afghanistan. If you walk through Kabul or a remote village in Uruzgan, you can definitely encounter people with light eyes, hazel, grey, green, even piercing blue, people with dark hair, brown skin, Central Asian features, and eyes that wouldn't look out of place in Sweden. For a long time, travelers treated these people like living conspiracy theories. The lost Roman legion, descendants of Alexander the Great's soldiers, secret Europeans. The truth is both less romantic and more interesting. Afghanistan sits at a crossroads. Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East. Armies have passed through here for millennia. Indo-Iranian steppe riders, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Mongols. Every invasion, every migration brought new genes, including the European origin HERX2 mutation for blue eyes. Then the mountains did something important. They trapped people. Isolated valleys, endogamous communities, small populations mostly marrying among themselves. This is the perfect recipe for rare traits to stick around and sometimes become more visible. You don't need a lost legion. You just need one or a few carriers of the mutation and a few hundred years of genetic isolation. Result: a village where 3 brothers have sky blue eyes, and their grandparents and cousins do too, even if they don't think of themselves as anything other than Afghan. The same pattern pops up in parts of the Middle East, in places like Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, northern Iraq, and Iran. Most people have brown eyes, But light-colored eyes are there, much more common than you would expect if blue eyes were supposed to be only in northern Europe. Scattered in old city neighborhoods and mountain towns, you can find families with green, grey and blue eyes, often with no recent European ancestors. Why? Because for thousands of years this region was the superhighway of the ancient world. The Fertile Crescent, the Levant, Anatolia. These are the corridors where early farmers, Indo-European speakers, and later steppe migrants moved. Ancient DNA from skeletons in the Near East shows clear traces of gene flow from populations related to early Europeans and later steppe herders. The blue eye mutation traveled along. Once it enters a population, it doesn't just disappear because most people around you have brown eyes. It hides as recessive combinations, surfacing in the next generation. When two carriers happen to have children together, it disappears again, then pops up in a distant cousin. To the family it feels like random chance. To a geneticist, it is the echo of 5,000 or 6,000-year-old migrations. Then there is North Africa. If you stand in a market in Marrakech, Tunis or Algiers and just watch faces, you see something that doesn't fit the simple Africa equals dark eyes, Europe equals light eyes narrative. You see people who could easily pass in southern Spain or Sicily, olive skin, dark or auburn hair, and grey, blue or green eyes. A big part of this story belongs to the Berbers or Amazigh people, the indigenous peoples of North Africa, whose roots stretch back long before Arab conquests, before Rome, even before the pyramids. Genetic studies on Berber-speaking communities in Morocco, Algeria, and parts of the Sahara show surprisingly high frequencies of European-linked variants, including the blue eye mutation. How did they get there? Two main ways. First, geography. North Africa and southern Europe are separated by a narrow sea, not an impenetrable wall. For tens of thousands of years, people crossed the Mediterranean in both directions. Traders, fishermen, migrants, invaders, early European farmers, Phoenician merchants, Roman settlers, Vandals, Visigoths, later Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, all brought small but steady drops of European genes. Second, isolation. Again, many Berber groups historically lived in relatively closed communities, in mountain villages in the Atlas Range, in deep Saharan oases. Limited marriage outside the group means any genetic variants present, including light eye colors, can drift to higher frequencies. That is why some Berber communities have blue or green eye rates rivaling parts of southern Europe, despite having firm roots in Africa. But you don't need to go to famous crossroads to find strange eye color pockets. Some of the clearest clues about human movement come from small isolated populations that have kept to themselves for centuries. Island groups, remote mountain villages, religious minorities marrying mostly within their own community. These are natural genetic laboratories. For example, on some isolated Baltic islands, blue eyes are so dominant that brown eyes are rare curiosities. In a few small communities in the Caucasus, or among specific groups like the Kalash in northern Pakistan, a tiny non-Muslim minority surrounded by Muslim neighbors, you find striking frequencies of light eyes surrounded by regions where dark eyes are overwhelmingly common. Light eyes and hair appear more frequently than you would expect for the region. When geneticists map these populations, they don't just see interesting eye colors, they see records of ancient migrations. Steppe herders pushing into South Asia, farmers expanding from Anatolia, sea traders leaving genetic calling cards on islands hundreds of miles from their homelands. Blue eyes are like tracer dye in the bloodstream of human history. Wherever they pop up in an unexpected place, you know there was a mix, a migration, a contact long ago. However, while blue eyes spread far from their cradle, something else is happening simultaneously. Their overall share of the human gene pool is shrinking. Surveys in the early 1900s suggested that in countries like the United States, over half of white Americans had blue eyes. Today that number is closer to a quarter and falling. Similar declines are happening in places like the UK, Germany and Australia, not because blue eyes are being selected against in a brutal Darwinian sense, but because the world we live in now is fundamentally different from the world that created that first blue eye explosion. For most of history, people tended to marry close to home. Villages, clans, religious groups, ethnic communities. In Northern and Eastern Europe, this meant blue eye genes mostly bounced back and forth between other blue eye carriers. Recessive traits love that kind of arrangement. Put two carriers together often enough and you get lots of blue-eyed children. Now look at the 21st century through a wide lens. Modern migration shuffles the deck. People from historically blue-eyed regions are having children with people from historically brown-eyed regions at rates unthinkable even a century ago. A blue-eyed Dane in London marries a brown-eyed Nigerian. A Polish-Filipino couple raises children in Chicago. A Syrian-Swedish family moves to Melbourne. In these matches, brown-eyed alleles are usually dominant in the first generation because brown is genetically dominant over blue. A blue-eyed parent and a brown-eyed parent will usually have brown-eyed children, but those children can still carry the blue-eye variant hidden in their DNA. So even if the underlying mutation is silently spreading to more genomes, the visible percentage of blue eyes drops. Give it a few generations and the picture gets even more complex. Two brown-eyed people who both carry a copy of the blue eye mutation can have a blue-eyed child. This surprises families, but not genetics. The trait is still there. It just doesn't cluster in obvious ways anymore. This is the paradox of our age. On one hand, classic blue-eyed countries are becoming more diverse. Pure ice blue eyes are statistically less common than a century ago. On the other hand, the blue eye mutation itself is more globally distributed than at any time in human history. It is no longer a regional oddity. It has touched the genomes of people who would never be coded as European in any social sense. So if you try to imagine the future, you don't get a world where blue eyes disappear completely. You get a world where they appear in increasingly unexpected places. A child in Sao Paulo with Japanese and Angolan grandparents. A family in Cairo whose great-grandfather came from Sicily. A teenager in Delhi with one Kashmiri and one Danish parent. Blue eyes may no longer dominate entire countries. Instead, they will pop up as genetic surprises, scattered across a truly global population. And this brings us back to the mutation itself. A single tiny change in a single person somewhere on the shores of the Baltic or Black Sea, thousands of years ago. It spread through hunters and gatherers, farmers and shepherds, traders and conquerors. It survived wars, plagues, famines, and the rise and fall of empires. It crossed deserts, mountain ranges, and oceans. It slipped into new gene pools and hid there for centuries, only to suddenly reveal itself in the gaze of a newborn baby. But this mutation didn't just change the color of our eyes. It did something weirder. It silently reshaped the human face. Until now, we have talked about blue eyes as if they were just eyes, a splash of color in the iris, a cosmetic detail. But that tiny mutation didn't just repaint the window, it silently remodeled the entire frame. Because the thing genetics almost never does is change just one thing. When that ancient mutation hit the OCA2 HERX2 region, the switch dimming melanin in the iris, it didn't land in an isolated eye color folder. It hit a control center, a regulatory region connected to a much larger system, helping decide how pigment forms, how tissue develops, how our faces come together, cell by cell in the womb. And when you start playing with regulators, you don't just get new colors, you get new faces. Modern genetic studies are brutally clear on this. When researchers scan hundreds of thousands of people looking for DNA variants linked to blue eyes, the same regions keep showing up in other traits. Lighter hair, lighter skin, slightly different nose shapes, differences in eyebrow thickness, even subtle changes in how bones around the eye socket grow. It is not as if a blue-eye gene is doing all this like a puppet master. This little neighborhood of DNA sits in the middle of a developmental conversation. How much melanin should we make? How thick should the tissues be here? How dense should the bone be underneath? Turn a dial, and the others shift slightly. Over thousands of years, this turned into something you can see in the mirror. Imagine your blue-eyed ancestor again. Not as a pair of bright irises floating in the void, but as a whole face your brain would read as different at first glance. Slightly lighter skin catching the low northern sun, freckles appearing and fading with the seasons, hair that might be chestnut or blonde instead of the deep black or dark brown dominating earlier populations. They wouldn't just have unusual eyes compared to their contemporaries. They would look like a new kind of human. And this wasn't just an aesthetic shift. It came with new trade-offs. Because melanin isn't just pigment, it is armor. Strip pigment from the iris, and you get a blue eye, but you also get an eye that takes in more light, more glare, more UV. That is why light-eyed people often squint more in bright sun, get dazzled easier, and are more prone to conditions like photophobia, light sensitivity, especially after eye injuries or surgeries. This doesn't mean blue eyes are defective, it means they are tuned for a different environment. Take that same blue-eyed person and drop them in a dark northern winter, low sun floating on the horizon for a few hours a day, and suddenly that extra light becomes an advantage. Their pupils don't need to open quite as wide. Their retinas get more photons for the same amount of effort. In an era before sunglasses, before artificial lighting, this might have mattered. However, the story doesn't end with brightness, because melanin also helps protect deeper structures of the eye from UV damage. Lighter-eyed people carry slightly higher lifetime risks for certain eye conditions like macular degeneration and some rare eye melanomas, especially if they also have very light skin. Numbers aren't destiny. They are probabilities shifting based on how much natural sunscreen your body builds. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Light eyes usually travel with lighter skin, and in high UV environments, lighter skin raises risks of skin cancer, sun damage, and cataracts. Move those same light-skinned, light-eyed people to low UV environments, and suddenly that reduced melanin helps them synthesize vitamin D more efficiently from weak sunlight. Costs and benefits shift depending on latitude. In other words, health is context, and that context has followed blue eyes into the modern world in subtler ways. Some studies have found weak links between eye color and pain sensitivity, between iris color and risk of certain autoimmune conditions, even between eye color and how people react to some medications or alcohol. None of these findings are simple. None are definitive, and many are still debated, but together they paint a picture, change one part of the developmental web, and tiny ripples spread through the whole body. The world, of course, saw none of this as gene networks and developmental trade-offs. It saw faces. To ancient farmers in Europe, the first blue eyes might have been signs of strangeness or magic, or lineage from those people over there. To Bronze Age traders moving across the steppe, eye color might have served as a kind of living passport stamp, proof of mixture, migration, alliance. As cultures grew complex, these perceptions turned into stories. Myths and legends from across Eurasia often mark characters with unusually light or bright eyes. Seers, heroes, strangers, witches, divine messengers. In some traditions, blue eyes became symbols of luck and protection. The Mediterranean evil eye beads are often painted bright blue, as if turning the gaze of misfortune back on itself. In others, they symbolize danger, foreignness, invasion. Fast forward to more recent history, and blue eyes took on a new role, status marker. As European empires expanded, the traits most common in their ruling populations, light skin, light hair, light eyes, were elevated into beauty standards and more insidiously into false hierarchies of human worth. Paintings, novels, early movies, again and again you see blue eyes cast as innocent, pure, noble, superior. It wasn't biology talking, it was power writing itself onto people's faces. Then came the darkest chapter. In the 19th and 20th centuries, early genetic ideas were hijacked by eugenics movements. Blue eyes, along with other Nordic traits, were recast as markers of racial purity. Pseudoscientists measured skulls, catalogued eye colors, drew imaginary maps of superior and inferior races. In Nazi Germany, this obsession reached its logical horror: Aryan ideals. Blonde hair, blue eyes didn't just live on propaganda posters. They helped justify sterilizations, forced breeding programs, and ultimately genocide. An essentially neutral trait born of a little tweak in a pigment pathway was twisted into an excuse for mass murder, all stemming from a single mutation that originally did nothing more than lighten an iris. This is why getting the genetics right is so important. There is nothing inherently superior or inferior about blue eyes or any eye color. They are all different solutions to the same set of environmental and historical puzzles, ways human populations living at different latitudes, with different diets and cultures, solved the basic problem of surviving long enough to have children. Modern genetics supports this relentlessly. When researchers analyze massive genomic datasets today, they don't see clean racial categories. They see gradients, overlaps, intertwined histories. The same blue eye variant common in Northern Europe pops up in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in individuals scattered worldwide, thanks to migration, trade, conquest, and love stories that never made it into any history book. What they see is something subtler and more fascinating, a genetic mosaic behind every face. Each of your facial features, eye shape, nose width, lip fullness, cheekbone height, jaw angle, is influenced by hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny genetic variants. No single gene decides your nose. No single mutation creates your smile. Instead, your face is an emergent property of a gene orchestra playing together during development, responding not just to DNA but to hormones, nutrients, and random events in the womb. Eye color genes sit inside that orchestra. That blue eye mutation in HERX2 doesn't just turn an iris from brown to blue. It interacts with other pigment genes affecting hair, freckles, and skin tone. Nearby regulatory regions influence how tissues grow around the eye socket, which can subtly alter visible eye size or shape. Other variants in the same neighborhoods tweak collagen, bone density, even how fat is distributed under the skin. Geneticists are just starting to decode this. In the last few years, massive studies took 3D scans of faces and linked specific tiny facial features to specific regions of the genome. They found clusters of variants shifting the nose bridge by a few millimeters, others changing how prominent the chin is or how round the cheeks are. And again, pigment-related regions like those involved in eye color show up not just in color traits but in subtle structural ones. The same developmental toolkits get reused across the face. In other words, we are still learning what that ancient blue eye mutation actually does. It didn't just give a hunter in Mesolithic Europe a new iris shade. It poked an entire developmental network. It changed how light interacts with their face. It changed how others saw them, judged them, chose them as mates, feared them as strangers, or celebrated them in legend. Over thousands of years, these small shifts shaped migration patterns, beauty standards, social hierarchies, and eventually scientific obsessions. A flicker in a pigment pathway echoed right into culture, politics, and identity. Today, when you look at a blue eye, your own, a friend's, or a stranger's, you aren't just seeing color. You are seeing the visible edge of a much deeper story. A mutation that retuned light sensitivity, reshaped risk and resistance, remodeled the human face, and then got mixed up in everything humans do best and worst: storytelling, tribalism, curiosity, cruelty, love, And the weirdest part is, we still don't know the whole story, because blue eyes are just a small chapter in a much larger unfinished book, how our faces got to look like this, and how they are still changing. So where does this leave us now, looking into the eyes of the future? Look around on a crowded city street today. You are seeing the result of tens of thousands of years of migration, conquest, famine, sexual preference, and random chance written in the pigment at the front of the eye. Dark brown, amber, hazel, green, grey, blue, a living map of human history compressed into a single glance. But that map is still changing. Right now, globally, brown still absolutely dominates. Depending on how you count, 70–80% of people alive today have dark brown eyes. Blue and grey combined are maybe 8–10%. Green is even rarer, and those lighter colours are concentrated in just a few regions. Northern and Eastern Europe, parts of Central Asia, scattered pockets created by migration in the Americas and Australia. Yet those regional clusters are dissolving. For most of human history, people tended to marry within their own village, valley, or at most neighbouring regions. This held local eye colour patterns steady. If your valley was 90% brown-eyed, it tended to stay that way for centuries. If your coastal town in the Baltic was 40% blue-eyed, those ratios lasted for centuries. Now the valley is the entire planet. People from every continent are meeting, marrying, and having children on a scale unprecedented in human history. Planes and dating apps have done more to shuffle human genes in the last 50 years than all empires did in a millennium. And as this happens, local oddities start to average out. Fast forward the numbers a few centuries, and projections start to converge on a similar picture. Less extremes, more mixture. In a world where everyone's ancestry is a complex braid of Africa, Europe, Asia, Americas, and Oceania, pure deep brown or ice blue will likely become less common. Hazels and lighter browns will spread, intermediate tones, eyes that shift between brown and green in different lights. Subtle grey or gold rings around the pupil will become the norm. Not because blue is disappearing, but because blue is blending. The OCA2-HERC2 mutation that first created blue eyes doesn't vanish when a blue-eyed person has children with a brown-eyed partner. It just hides and waits. Two carriers, brown or hazel-eyed people who still carry that ancestral mutation, can have a blue-eyed child, even if no one in the family has been visibly blue-eyed for generations. Genetics doesn't care what your passport says. It just follows the rules of inheritance. But now a new player has entered the stage, one that doesn't care about slow generational math at all. Gene editing. Today, if you really want to change your eye color, you go to a surgeon, not a geneticist. You get colored contact lenses or undergo risky iris surgery or laser depigmentation. These are all surface-level tricks. The DNA in your cells still carries the eye color variants you were born with. CRISPR is changing that. In principle, we already have the tools to edit the OCA2-HERC2 region in an embryo, fine-tune the melanin machinery in the iris, and predetermine a baby's future eye color before they even open their eyes. In practice, we aren't close to doing this safely, ethically, or legally on any real scale, but the capability gets closer every year. Imagine a fertility clinic 150 years from now. The doctor isn't just checking for disease risks. She is scrolling through a menu. Height probabilities, hair texture probabilities, eye color options. Your child's default genetic outcome is dark hazel. But with this small edit, we can match your grandmother's blue. Do you want that? Do we? Changing eye color seems trivial compared to editing out a fatal disease. It feels like dyeing your hair at the DNA level, but it opens a door. If we are willing to tweak genes for something as symbolic and aesthetic as eye color, what else are we willing to rewrite? And who gets access? The wealthy, specific cultural groups? People chasing a particular beauty standard frozen in time? We could end up recreating old hierarchies in a new form. Blue eyes not as a random Mesolithic accident, but as a luxury consumer feature. A trait selected not by millennia of climate and luck, but by market demand. There is another risk. When we can engineer visible traits, we might be tempted to tidy up diversity. Parents might avoid unusual combinations. Clinics might quietly steer clients towards safe common palettes. Over time, the genetic diversity nature produced so painstakingly could be edited down, replaced by a homogeneity that feels comforting in the short term, but catastrophic in the long term, because that is the twist buried in the story of blue eyes. Blue eyes are a mistake that worked. A random mutation in one person in a small corner of prehistoric Europe made it through every filter of natural selection, not because it made you stronger, faster, or healthier, but because it made someone look at you for a second longer. Because it caught the light at twilight, triggered some ancient brain wiring about novelty, attention, and beauty. It could have easily gone the other way. That person could have died in childhood. Their children might not have had children of their own. A few ill-timed famines or plagues, and the entire blue-eyed lineage would have been wiped out before it began. The Earth we would live on today would look exactly the same. Same mountains, same oceans, same physics, but nowhere would anyone have blue eyes. We wouldn't even know they were possible. That is how fragile our normal is. Every visible feature you take for granted, eye color, hair texture, skin tone, face shape, is the result of thousands of coin flips coming up heads in this specific pattern. Different flips, different humans. So what does blue tell us about diversity? It tells us human variation isn't an orderly, optimized design. It is an ongoing experiment. It tells us two people on opposite sides of the planet who look totally different at a glance are likely carrying the same ancient mutation from that single Mesolithic person. That a blue-eyed child born in Brazil today and a blue-eyed child born in Finland today are distant cousins in a very real sense, and it tells us new surprises are still possible. Is the age of new eye colors over? Probably not. Mutations still happen in every generation. Most do nothing. Some break things. But every once in a while, a change in one of the many genes involved in melanin production, iris structure, or light scattering could alter the way our eyes handle color in ways we have never seen before. Imagine an iris reflecting light more like bird feathers, producing metallic shifting tones. Imagine a mutation enhancing structural color, deepening greens into something almost neon at certain angles. Unlikely, sure. Impossible? Not at all. Given enough time and enough humans, the improbable becomes almost guaranteed. The real questions aren't biological, they are social. If a radically new eye color appeared, a vivid turquoise, a strange gold that glowed in low light, how would we react? Would those individuals be celebrated, fetishized, feared, discriminated against, kept special, or pressured to conform? Our answer would say more about us than the mutation itself, because underneath all this talk of pigment and genetics lies a bigger truth. When you peel back the layers, iris color, skin tone, hair texture, bone shape, you find the same story running through all of us. The same scattered bands of survivors clinging on through the same old bottlenecks, droughts, and ice ages. The same tiny edits in DNA passed down in unbroken chains from parents to children for hundreds of thousands of years. Blue eyes are just one chapter of that story. A weird, beautiful footnote written by chance and amplified by desire. Stand in front of a mirror for a moment and look into your own eyes. Brown, blue, green, grey, hazel, it doesn't matter. Behind the color you see are the same fused chromosomes marking the survivors of ancient crises, the same brain-building, cooperation-fostering, language-sharpening genes that got us through extinction events again and again. In coming centuries, as populations mix, technology advances and gene editing moves from science fiction to daily clinical work, the The palette of human eyes might change. Blue might become rarer or more common or deliberately chosen. New shades might appear, old ones fade, but the most important thing won't change. Every eye, no matter its color, is a window opened by the same improbable process. A long line of ancestors who refused to break, who carried their genes through catastrophes and bottlenecks, wars and plagues, all the way to you. We like to divide ourselves by what we can see. This color, that color, these features, those features. The story of blue eyes reminds us that what looks like a difference is usually just a different way of being the same thing, human. And underneath every shade, every glint, every pattern in the iris, one truth stares back at us. We are all surviving mutations. So next time you see a blue eye, you aren't just looking at a color, you are looking at the fallout of a single genetic accident that refused to stay small. A single tiny mutation in one person, somewhere, in a moment of deep time, and somehow it didn't get lost in the noise of history. It survived, passed from parent to child, village to village, through ice sheets and forests and coastlines, hitchhiking on love, desire, hunger, and sheer dumb luck until it rewrote the face of half a continent. Every pair of blue eyes on this planet is essentially a shard from the same ancient mirror. Whether your gaze is the color of steel, the deep Baltic Sea, or that indecisive shade between green and gray, it is powered by the same faulty wiring in your DNA. If you could rewind your family tape far enough, you would find yourself standing in front of the exact same person as every other blue-eyed soul. And this ancestor wasn't a conqueror or a deity. They were likely just an ordinary parent trying to keep their children warm, unaware that their genes were quietly rewriting the future of the human face. This creates a bizarre and beautiful kinship across the globe. If you carry this trait, you are in a very literal genetic sense a cousin to millions of strangers. You share an invisible bond with the commuter in Stockholm, the farmer tilling soil in Syria, and the fisherman casting nets in Greece. You are all linked by a single biological typo, a copying error that has been faithfully transcribed and passed down through thousands of generations. But for those of you with brown, hazel, or deep black eyes, do not think for a second that you are left out of this epic. The blue eye mutation is merely a recent coat of paint on a much more ancient structure, a foundation built by the survival of the fittest. The same elemental forces that merged our chromosomes and pushed our species through ice ages are the ones that decided this little pigment trick was worth keeping. Blue eyes are just one colorful thread woven into the massive shared tapestry of every human being who has ever breathed. This is the ultimate lesson of our past. Evolution isn't always about dramatic leaps or creating entirely new species. Often it is about the accumulation of tiny, subtle whispers, a single amino acid swapping places, a regulatory switch dimmed just a fraction, a quirk that made someone stand out by a Mesolithic campfire or helped a child absorb a bit more sun in a dark winter, eventually reshaping our culture and our art. Blue eyes were never part of a grand design. They were a beautiful improv act of nature that just happened to stick. So the next time you catch your reflection in a mirror, take a moment to look beyond the surface. Don't just see a color, see the storms, the migrations, the romances, and the sheer endurance of your ancestors, all compressed into that tiny, fragile circle. Good night.